All right, here it is. It'll be quick, but painful. I believe it was in November. John Riccolo, myself, Jerry and Gordo, we had
Honestly, you don't need to tell this.
a lunch. I happened to spend a lot of time there. As a matter of fact, that's where our Portuguese wine comes from, that we have our events there. And Jerry came from Long Island, and we all met up, and they jumped in my car, and we went off to the restaurant. And we were having a great time. John happened in the parking lots and things of those sorts. So he said, well, I'll just park over here. Where did you park, John?
Well, Princeton Junction. I can still hear it, but you feedback.
No, I can turn it down.
But no, I put it down at the end in an open area where it was easy pickings for somebody to, you know, the parking attendant. If they had had the kiosk like the old days, I would have walked up, put my money in, put the space in, and that would have been it.
Okay, so you weren't looking to get away with anything,
No,
right?
They
No.
had a little bitty sign that said, money in, just pay.
Right.
I don't want to download your friggin' app.
Right.
And the ticket, and okay, you get a parking ticket. The only other parking ticket I ever got in my life wasn't that many years ago, was $35. This ticket was $75.
So-
I mean, come on.
So it was,
But it was, we had a great time.
we had a good time.
62.
Yes.
That was a senior discount.
Oh, it just wasn't my day.
Oh, my God. All right.
But the food was great.
The food was great. We had a good time. All right. I'm sorry, okay?
That's okay.
This evening, we have our own physicist, all right? You want to tell yourself a little about yourself?
Well, I'm Jonathan Allen. My background officially is as a physicist, but I've done a lot of work. All right. And I've done a lot of work with old electronics and radio as a hobby. I also serve as a docent and artifact restorer at the Sarnoff Museum at the College of New Jersey. So if my talk tends to, you can understand why that may be so. So if you don't mind, I'm going to get started. The title of my talk here is Gown of the IEEE History Center and Ben Gross at the Linda Hall Library in Kansas City. He used to be at College of New Jersey, for their assistance in searching for some of the historical documents. I also want to thank our fellow member, Scott Marshall, for a lot of his. Anyhow, since the 1980s, Silicon Valley has been the center for American and possibly global electronic innovation. Before that, however, starting around 1900, the hub was New Jersey and to some extent New York City. And most of the electronics we have now, wireless communication and vacuum tubes, but it evolved into many additional technologies. Given our limited time, we will concentrate on the most important, and if some of them really are of great interest, and people want to hear a talk specific to those topics, let me know, and maybe at some future time I'll give you a spiel on that. So let's look at the topics that we have. Broadcasting and networks, electrical and electronic instrumentation, FM radio, television, transistors, electronic computers, and the Fort Monmouth and military electronics. I'm going to go easy on that because the club obviously is based there and has a lot of knowledge, probably more than I do on that particular. Clerk Maxwell in Scotland worked out the famous equations that bear his name and which predicted electromagnetic waves. Then between 1887 and 89, Heinrich Hertz in Hamburg demonstrated. He published his results, but could conceive at that time of no practical use. Additional experiments somewhat increased the distances. Magnetic waves to communicate over increasing ranges. In 1899, he opened the branch of his company, British Marconi. These are the slides, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a slide. That's a slide. Thank you. There's some slides with pretty pictures on it too. He opened a Marconi, American Marconi Incorporated here in New Jersey, and that year is stationed at Sandy Hook, New Jersey, and New York City. For the 1901 race, however, the atmospheric conditions weren't so good, and the reporting did not go well. However, the Publishers Association had brought the experimenter Lee DeForest from Chicago to New Jersey. And for some reason, he decided he would stay here, and he became a Jersey boy. Transatlantic radio signal all the way from England to Newfoundland on a multi-kilowatt spark transmitter and with a coherent detector at a frequency of around 300 kilohertz. And here we have the spark represents an alternator which generates a relatively high AC frequency. When you hit the key, the AC frequency gets induced in here. It triggers this spark gap, which generates higher frequencies, which then go out the antenna and into the ether. And here we have the transmitting antenna, because if you see over here, this is a house, a cabin. And you get an idea of how big this thing must have been. Well, of course, with a frequency of just a few hundred kilohertz, the antenna's got to be pretty big. As both transmitters and receivers, and Marconi was already incorporated here in New Jersey, he set up a transmitting station and a receiver in Belmar at Camp Evans. And as was discussed earlier, stations to ships with Marconi Company operators as contractors, not crew members. And by 1904, 32 ships were so fitted. Oh, in 1911, Marconi contractors of the stores in Philly and New York City. He gained a high up place to set up his transmitters for obvious reasons. And here we have the roof. They want to make a station, and you can see the little shacks on the roof. Here's the transmission line, the feed line. Here's the antenna, and these two towers support it. Sarnoff came on duty on April 15, 1912, the morning after the Titanic struck the iceberg. He worked to help with rescue and search. The adventure. This keyboard keeps sliding away. Okay, here we have him at his station at Sarnoff, and by the way, at the Sarnoff Museum, we have the telegraph key that he used for this operation. The station continued to evolve and was of considerable value strategically during the First World War. So after the war, in 1919, the U.S. government decided that radio communication was too important to the public good, what we now call national security, to be in the hands of a foreign company, even a friendly foreign company, Britain. Therefore, the government helped GE buy out American Marconi and establish the Radio Corporation of America to take over their wireless, where RCA began going beyond just maintaining the wireless channels. The spark transmitter generates a damped wave each time the induction coil fires, so the receiver output is a harsh buzz. Okay, requires a clean, continuous sine wave. The Alexander alternator was the first attempt to solve this problem. It uses a very high RPM rotation and a huge number of armature poles, and they can be made to generate a sinusoidal AC up to about 200 kilohertz using magnetic amplifiers in the alternator field circuit. But truly successful voice radio became possible only after the invention of reliable, vacuumable RF. So how did this invention begin? Well, literally as well as symbolically, it started with the glowing light bulb. Thomas Edison, a Jersey boy of course, was first to document the thermionic emission we still call the Edison effect. In 1875, he observed dark deposits of evaporated carbon from the filament. In those days they used carbon filaments, they hadn't figured out how to do tungsten, in the interior of his lamps. But there was a curious shade, very dedicated to that. Somehow the effect was influenced by electric fields. So Edison, out of curiosity, installed a metal plate inside the evacuated bulb and facing the filament. If the plate was positive with respect to the filament, a current flowed between them. If it was negative, no current. He patented the effect. He patented everything he could. and published the findings in 1883. Of course, there was no physical theory, nor could Edison suggest much in the way of practical use. But then 14 years later, in 1897, the English physicist J.J. Thomson discovered the electron. He made of electric current. The next big event was in January 1904, when John Ambrose Fleming in England, building on Edison and Thomson's discovery, exploited the one-way conduction to rectify and thus detect radio signals, far better than the coherer, which was really a lousy detector, but the best they had at the time. And here we have a circuit for the Fleming valve detector. And what you've got is the signal, this keyboard a little bit, there's not enough room for everything here, and gets rectified by the filament plate, like just as with any diode, and then gets fed to. Well, the next big step, RF signals in the transmitter. In Jersey City, Lee DeForest, whom we introduced a little while ago, was experimenting with his version of the valve and noticed that electric fields outside the bulb could alter the plate current. What if the field was put inside, in the path of the current? Well, in 1906, he patented the Audion, which we now recognize as a triode because of the three elements. You've got your filament, or cathode, the grid, and the plate in an inline arrangement. And here's a photo of an Audion, the grid, you can see it zigzagging there, and the plate finally in back there. And the connections to those come out through the other end of the bulb. Well, the original DeForest Audion, anyway, this is how the Audion was used in a radio detector circuit. The signal comes in through the antenna, gets into the grid of the tube. This grid leak resistor was not used way back then. That came along later. And phones, and you listen to it. But unfortunately, the Audion had shortcomings, and here's a list of them. A crappy vacuum with residual gas, no grid leak or other fixed bias, less than optimum inline geometry, unreliable with short life, and DeForest meant the pressure was around 10 to the minus 4th torr. A torr, by the way, is a millimeter of mercury, and it's considered pretty crap into air molecules. There was no grid leak or other way to set a proper bias on the grid life, in part due to the crappy vacuum. But the most serious problem is that DeForest did not understand the theory. For example, perhaps we can excuse this because the electron had been discovered only 8 years earlier, and the results appeared in physics rather than engineering journals. Next major development, surprisingly, came not in wireless, but in wired communication, telephone. It's calls. Fatter wires and impedance matching loading coils invented by Oliver Heaviside helped, but you can only go so far in both sides of a transcontinental telephone line all the way from New York City to San Francisco for the night, requiring amplified repeaters along the route. The concept of and that's where the word relay comes from. Just as a messenger pulls in the armature, which then closes the circuit for a fairly high voltage battery to stuff the signal into the next line down along its way. Problem is, a relay is either on or off, hardly up to the job. AT&T saw its potential, so they bought a license from Western Electric Research with Audion into a phone repeater. A team headed by Dr. Harold Arnold undertook a dedicated program. It's Irving Langmuir. Arnold, and especially Langmuir, recognized that residual gas was not only unnecessary, but it was no good. So both teams exploited the advances in improved vacuum pumps to get a hard vacuum in the range of 10 to the minus 6 to 10 to the minus 7 torr. Once again, torr is 1 millimeter of mercury, and is named for Evangelista Torricelli, who invented the barometer in 1643, the mercury atmosphere. Langmuir at GE in 1913 applied rigorous physics to the design of electron tubes improving the design, the geometry, and especially the performance. And here we have the concentric triode, where the filament or cathode runs up the middle. The grid is a plate that goes all the way around, so electron emission can occur in all directions. And the filament, the grid is placed close to the cathode in order to modulate the space charge and have a stronger amplifying effect. In other words, the field that's generated by the electrons in transit. Linear part of the transfer curve to gain the best gain and linearity. 100 miles. Thereafter, they rushed to build the transcontinental line. And here we have the completion of the transcontinental telephone line. And it's a scene at the Utah-Nevada border, a scene reminiscent of driving the Golden 15, occurred with great fanfare. It demonstrated to the world that the vacuum tube is a reliable amplifier. Well, there are other tubes. At Columbia University was a hero who developed most of the new vacuum tube circuits. He field tested, got to get both states, got to get both places in here now, yeah. Armstrong's first major accomplishment was to exploit the which generated clean sinusoidal RF at accurate and stable frequencies. And here we have the Armstrong oscillator, and you get the positive feedback, gets this tuned circuit. But he oscillative receiver. It allowed one tube to have a gain of tens of thousands, and the selectivity was achieved because the tickler fed power back into the tuned circuit that compensated for the dissipation that was in. This was very important given the high cost of tubes. You could get one tube breaks into oscillation, radiating RF back out the antenna and interfering with other receivers in the neighborhood. Here we have a schematic of the regenerative receiver. You can see it's very similar geometrically, or you can adjust the filament voltage, which is another way of adjusting the gain of the tube. And once again, you come off the plate with the amplified signal, which goes to your headphones, and you listen. Well, in 1918, while serving in the Army Signal Corps during World War I, circuit. Oh, I'm sorry. This is a commercial regenerative receiver, the Areola Senior, made by RCA, for RCA by Westinghouse. RCA at that time did not have real manufacturing capacity, so they farmed it out to Westinghouse. So both brands appear on the cover. Now, I'm sorry about that mix-up. Now we have the superhead. The signal goes into an RF amplifier. Some crummy sets don't even have that, but anyway, it goes into a mixer where the signal gets mixed with the output of a local oscillator, 55 kilohertz. Then you go through the IF amplifier, which amplifies that difference. Let's talk now communications. But as more people, where the farmer rather casts them over the tilled field, and here we have broadcasting in its original sense. One transmitter thus spreads its signal in New Jersey, and in 1926, RCA founded the National Broadcasting Company, NBC. And by leasing long-distance phone lines, ABC and CBS also started about this time, as did the smaller, now-defunct Dumont network. Triodes and pentodes, which provided vastly improved gain and stability, especially at the higher radio frequencies. The mixer and local oscillator and first detector. And here we have a picture showing tube evolution, finally ending up in this little thing called a nuvistor. It looks like a found its use in UH, especially in UH. So next is electronic instrumentation, servicing. Inventors and companies in New Jersey, New York City area pioneered this as well. In 1888, he founded the Weston Electrical Instrument Company in Newark. His products were at our, now we're talking about sets made before the turn of the 20th century, meters. While such meters are not tested on Model 1, built around 1890, it's a millivolt meter, reads 10 and 20 millivolts. In fact, still good to about 1/4%. The next, which tells you how stable he made, and this is an electrodynamometer, so in fact it compensates for power factor. And now classical voltmeters, as we all know, works by feeding the unknown voltage through a precision resistor into a milli or micro. However, the voltage source has internal series resistance. The current to deflect the meter will load the source and give an erroneously low reading. The vacuum 2 voltmeter did input resistance ahead of the meter, thereby eliminating the loading error, and in addition, the limited plate saturation current. Here we have a schematic of a VTVM. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, it's a little fuzzy. This is the best drawing I could get. It uses data stability and accuracy and linearity and such. And it uses the tubes are wired as cathode followers. Anyway, RCA a little while later introduced they had a whole chain of service shops which repaired their radios and later televisions. A low-level signal of calibrated amplitude and frequency, which can be used for testing. And other companies invented and produced more specialized instruments. Booten Radio and its spin-offs started in the town of that name. And the instrument that made the company most famous, at least by my understanding, is the Q meter. What the Q meter does is it can accurately measure the inductance and Q of RF coils at their working frequencies by placing a dot here. Okay. A series resonance circuit with a variable capacitor. The input voltage at the end of the circuit is what gives you your Q. Operation also in Booten, probably best known for its outstanding Model 59 grid dip meter, sold as the Mega. The meter, the readout meter and power supply, and the 3 head, medium and high. Here are the plug-in coils that plug in to the lives in the top of the suitcase-like box. So next item is FM radio. So it's electronic frequency modulation, which was talked about a little earlier here. I know most of you know a lot of that, but I'm trying to make this available to everyone. You have your carrier, which is a high frequency sine wave, and here's your amplitude is what gets modulated by mixing the two. For FM, the amplitude is constant. The problem with AM is atmospheric noise, natural plus man-made interference, which have AM. Working in his lab at Columbia University, Armstrong reasoned that he could eliminate the parameter to the oscillator in order to get that frequency shift. At the receiving end, the IF amplifier signal level, thus erasing any amplitude modulation, including static, before it get a chance to reach the detector. And finally, a circuit called the discriminator served as a detector to convert frequency fluctuations back into their original audio content. And he patented this, but the FM is actually quite similar. It goes through the RF amplifier modulation system, the frequency. So he patented it, but Sarnoff had invested a fortune in AM, and with his in 1937, Armstrong built his own station at the Palisades to broadcast across New York City. And here we have Armstrong's tower. And these arms hold multiple antennas, megahertz in the newly assigned 42 to 50 band. But over the next few years, Sarnoff then realized he had missed the boat, and the feelings between the two men turned nasty. The feud between them continued, and in 1945, at 88 to 108 megahertz band, and Armstrong's system now was out of business. And radio astronomy. Sometimes discoveries come about by accident. But to quote Louis Pasteur, chance favors the prepared mind. Was experimenting with short waves around 20 megahertz for transoceanic phone communication. But there appeared to be an irreducible source of noise named Karl Jansky to analyze the sources. He built a fully steerable directional antenna. And here we have it. Even after accounting for atmospherics and the receiver's internal noise sources, Jansky still picked up a continuous hiss coming from the sky. He tracked it for over a year, sidereal rather than solar time, and he finally concluded that it was coming from the center of the Milky Way galaxy. Thus was born radio astronomy. Unfortunately, once Bell now had identified the recognized field, and the unit of signal intensity, which we use to this day for radio astronomy, is called the Jansky. And 1 Jansky, -6 watts per square meter, divided by the frequency in hertz. So at 1 gigahertz, 1 Jansky equals 10 to the minus 17 watts per square meter. That ain't a very strong signal, but when you get a signal coming from many light years away, it's not going to be. Bell Labs scientists Robert Wilson and Arno Penzias discovered the microwave background radiation residue from the Big Bang board and designated as an historic artifact. And the background was strong evidence of the newly conceived Big Bang theory, and earned the two gentlemen the transmitters were transmitting moving pictures over wires and even over radio. The earliest systems used mechanical scanning, such as the Nipkow disc, and you can look that up if you're really interested, for both transmitting and receiving, until vacuum tubes made electronic television feasible. In the 1920s, and in spite of its very poor sensitivity, it was the best they had. You had to have basically full sunlight for a good picture. And at the other end, they had the skin. He started the research at Westinghouse in Pittsburgh, but the company showed little interest in television, so he therefore moved to RCA in Camden in 1930, where Sarnoff was anxious to support his projects. Developed New York World's Fair. And here we have the famous picture of Sarnoff at the World's Fair with the TV camera in front of him. And there was a screen off to the side where you could see the image, and it was, I believe, set up so that visitors to the fair could walk in front of the camera and then see their image on the receiver, which was located nearby, but was suspended during World War II because of the need to build electronics for the military, although a little limited in broadcasting did continue. So did means straight. And the name implies the inline geometry versus the offset iconoscope. The emission, very similar to a photomultiplier tube, by secondary emission, raising. And by the way, a piece of etymology here. The IMI actually became a very common word, almost synonymous with successful television broadcasting. And when the trophy for achievement in the radio, in the television arts and science. At the receiving end, RCA introduced improved cathode ray tubes. Instead of electric reflection was much greater, so the ratio of the tube length to width was a lot less. Okay, the first, which has a 7-inch screen, 1946, 8 TS30 with a 10-inch screen, which is the first really mass-produced set. And by the way, we have one operating. Well, we've got black and white TV. What about color? Tried the field sequential system by placing a tricolor red, green, blue glass by both the camera and the picture frame of each color in sequence, while the same color filter is in this. You can imagine the problem if you get into big screens like we have today. Incidentally, the Apollo mission cameras, the CBS system, because just for transmitting, Systems Committee and FCC scrutiny, it became the U.S. standard in 1953 and 54. And here we have the subject. It's focused by a lens, and the output light of the lens goes so that the blue light comes this way, the green goes this way, and the red goes that way, each to its own camera tube. That allowed the red, green, blue, and blue own a black and white set, which most people did. Color was pretty expensive in those early days. Black and white program, and you had your color set, you could watch it in black and white without actually having to switch anything. Was the RCA CT100, and engineers kept pushing radio to higher frequencies, but at 100 the plate and the cathode, and the time it just isn't rectifying as you. OHL is how he spelled his name, explored silicon detectors which had silicon that he made, samples that he made into point contact gigahertz frequencies. The effect of silicon, that is, when light shines in silicon, it can generate an electric current higher than they had observed earlier for copper oxide or silicon. We'll get into photovoltaics in a little while. After the war, Bell Labs continued its experiments to the deforest triode. At that time, silicon was too difficult to purify and dope, so they made carbon, silicon, and then germanium next below it in that column 4. Bertain created and demonstrated the first point contact transistor which could actually amplify a signal. And here we have a picture of the structure. AT&T's terms as a regulated monopoly was that they had to license the transistor, and mass production began in 1952. Germanium junction transistors soon became available, which was a favorite of experimenters and hobbyists, and the 2N107 could be compact on batteries. Remember, vacuum tube portable radios need plate voltage. A pocket radio, which is just about 3 by 4 by 1 inch. Radio is working to this day. Now, once the silicon purification process and the transistors had generally better performance. The most dramatic application, millions of active devices and millions of vacuum tubes have just become almost impossible to manage. Even before the John von Neumann worked at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton from 1933 until he died in 1957. He conceived the idea of storing them, contributed to the design of early government and War Department computers. He also did additional work on computers for the military. Once businesses recognized the value of computers, the 301 and 601 systems for business and scientific computing. In the 1970s, Joseph Weisbecker at RCA built a COSMAC microcomputer. This is one of the COSMAC models. It was somewhat similar to the Altair, which came out much later. His daughter Joyce invented games and wrote the software. Okay, now we get to solar photovoltaics. The first solar photovoltaic cells were made by Bell Labs. There was the crystalline quantity manufacturing of them. They were just used very selectively for special purposes. But New Jersey was also the home, cheap and available. And here we have, these worked with amorphous silicon. Here we have the 1x, which are set up on a sun-facing array. Chrona's headquarters, silicon panels, which though less efficient than crystalline silicon, and it would still be more economic than the crystalline. I worked at Chrona doing R&D for much of the company's history, from 1983 to 1993. To go out of business in the early 1990s. There were numerous other inventions from the New York, if people are interested, but let me just list a few. Recording and reproduction. This is video, television, and digital data. Microwaves and radar. While a lot of fame went to the MIT Radiation Lab, important to the Allied victory in that conflict. As I say, I'm minimizing discussion of the, though invented in Europe in the 1930s as one-off devices, electron microscope is that the finest resolution you can get with an optical instrument is determined by the light. It's about 1/2 micron. Now, accelerated through tens or even hundreds of kilovolts is several orders of magnitude. And finally, we have Project Diana, space program. And if you're going to have a space program and you're going to send things up way beyond the atmosphere, you're going to talk to them. And they're going to talk back to you by radio. Now, we learned that radio waves the atmosphere and how much penetrates. Does enough penetrate that you can make usable contact? Well, there was nothing up there that we could communicate with. So radio, it sent a signal to the moon, and you can see the moon there just waiting for that. The signal comes back to you, and it did. The signal was penetrating the atmosphere. They were working with radio sphere. New Jersey and New York City should be proud of their numerous and diverse contributions toward creating the modern world of.
Jonathan, could you talk about the Sarnoff
Museum?
Museum? Yes.
Well, at the College of New Jersey, we have the Sarnoff Museum. But when that got, when RCA got taken over and sold out by Stanford Research Institute, they no longer wanted to have the museum there, which opened up a museum where these were on display. It was under the management of the art department. Why the art department? Well, they were the department of the college that handled exhibits. You may have heard of was a professor at the college. He died recently, unfortunately. Drafted me to help, and for the past about 12 years, I've been working at the Sarnoff. All the crap that you have to do, but of late, the funding has been a problem. And as you know, funding for the sciences these days in this country has suffered a very serious setback. And so that may make the problem private source of funding, not so much through government. Although maybe the state of New Jersey can help, I don't know. But Sarnoff Museum, and that.
Do you have hours?
Well, we used to be open every Wednesday afternoon and every Sunday afternoon, but now we're open on just the second Wednesday and fourth Wednesday. I'll drag my ass in there and give them the show.
Want to do some question and answer?
Yeah, of course. That's the whole idea. Sorry, please, if you got any questions, I'll do the best I can. Yes, please.
Why Diane? Where's?
She is an archer, so she shoots things along. She also has a close affiliation with the fully qualified goddess. Got all the credentials. Yeah. Oh, you're talking about the feedback, the oscillator? That's the Q meter. I'll keep cranking back. Hold it. $30. They become more hot now.
Yeah, I mean, it was.
Anyway, you're looking at this, the regenerative receiver or the oscillator. Which were you? This is the relay. Was it the spark transmitter?
Yeah.
Oh, good. This is an audio.
So why couldn't they just have them in series?
Well, because the potential from the antenna, you've got, and here you have a parallel resonance circuit, so see, and that then gets rectified by the arrow on the end of this, so you can move this along the coil and get different.
I guess more like customized.
So you've got two adjustments. One is where this tap moving up and down here, and perhaps you can even move this tap on this coil in order to get yourself a wider tuning range, and you can if you have a range of capacitance of 16 to by just changing some of those settings. And that's what I presume is.
You should look at
Yeah.
Al Place's webpage. I've forgotten what these.
I agree.
Skyway, what is it?
A point contact crystal rectifier rather than a vacuum rectifier. So is that okay now?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. By the way, you do the same thing on transmitters, except the else we got here. Friends, anything else?
The post-war TV set. They only sold in 1940,000.
Oh, really? Let me see. Let's find those TV sets.
In the museum. It looks just, okay, we have a 621 in storage, but
Yeah, this is 621 TS, which is a 7.
actual, the next one was the 630 TS.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was the post-war set.
It's almost identical to that model.
Yeah.
Yeah,
looks-
okay.
looks-
Thing. They had a very limited tube lineup, and that meant that the repairman with his tube caddy could carry a
But yeah, the 630 was the iconic post-war set.
Okay, well, thank you.
I can make a little
guess I could make a comment on your comment about electron microscopes.
Yeah,
So what you say.
I said it, the
I
CG
know
specimen
you
has to be,
did.
that's right.
But you can do better than that. There's a phenomenon, it's called an end down, a cable where the diameter gets less than the wavelength of light. Light will propagate a short distance.
Oh, really?
And so you can scan it.
Yeah.
And they use this for sub-wavelength of light imaging of live objects.
Oh, isn't that amazing?
Technique in optics. So, you know, it's, optics has its limitations, wavelength of light. But this is a way to get around it.
Jonathan, I've always been sort of, I know this is not really central, but there was no parabolic reflector up there or anything. So how do you
Well, because they,
how do you hit the moon with a signal and know that it's going to bounce back?
well, because you have it out. And because parabolic antennas are much lower frequency than that. The phased array really works very well. Yeah, put a fair amount of poop into the outgoing signal, and they had a very sensitive receiver at the other end.
The receiver.
The receiver.
Oh, yeah.
Dan Marlowe of our physics department is trying
Is
to resurrect it.
how much of it is still?
No, wait. That antenna is gone. That was a stacked, I think.
What I mean?
There's the parabolic.
Oh, let's turn this thing off now.
There. The bed spring is gone. Yeah. No, it's been fixed at the mill. Okay. And they haven't shipped it.
Folks, can we have a little applause for So the July 11th is our next meeting here. All right, we are in our summer mode, and it'll be a Hints and Kinks. So